Had it not been the Lord who was on our side, the anger of the enemy would have swallowed us alive. Had it not been the Lord who was on our side, blessed be the Lord who would not give us up. Blessed be the Lord for his unfailing love. The
Well, thank everyone for being here this evening. We're going to be starting a new series like Alan mentioned. Before we do, though, I got a call from David Bingham just a little bit ago saying that he's already home and that they didn't find anything wrong with him. So he's just home and they told him to rest. And so just wanted to update you all on that. I'm sure if you're like me, you're wondering as well. Well, as we begin our new series, we're going to talk about the case for the real Jesus. And we're going to get into that in just a minute. But let me introduce it with a little bit of information. I would say, at least within myself, when I went off to college, I believed in God. I really, really believed in God. And that probably sounds pretty obvious, right? Okay, going into ministry, hopefully you believe in God. But in college, one of the things I got to do were take a lot of evidences courses. And those courses took me from what I would say believing there's a God to knowing that God exists. If that makes sense to you. There's a little bit more to it. The more I learned and the deeper things got, the more clear the picture became of God. And while there still has to be faith there and every question doesn't have an answer, at this point it's a I know type of a deal. And that's why I wanted to kind of move into this study. So we'll be doing this on our normal Sunday nights. We'll be talking about kind of pulling some lessons. We're not going to go word for word. If you've ever read Lee Strobel's book, The Case for the Real Jesus, we're not going to go word for word with it. What we're going to do is take those concepts, and we're going to look at those different concepts. And so we'll begin that study this evening. And one of the things that kind of stands out as you think about your belief and about faith in general is this word that you used to hear a ton about. About 5 years ago, maybe 5 or 6, the hottest buzzword in religious circles was authentic. It was important. The hashtag authentic was all over the place. It was everything. Every minister was posting that about their authentic faith. And I bought a pair of jeans this weekend. It just had a sticker that just said authentic on it, by the way. I don't know what it is authentic, but it had a sticker reminding me these are authentic jeans. And it's what made me think of this, is this whole idea that we want something that's real. We don't know what those genes, what they are real. I don't know if real kids in China put them together or what, but they're definitely real. But this whole idea of we want something very real in our lives. We want something that's authentic. We want that, whether it's, if I'm looking back over maybe 5 or 6 years ago, you would see people taking pictures of their morning devotional with their Bibles and their coffee every morning, right, with that hashtag authentic, or people spending 30 minutes getting just the right picture to say this is their authentic moment. And there's all these different ways. We were just really, really wanting for that. And there's nothing wrong with wanting something authentic. I think that's a really good idea. We want something authentic. We want something trustworthy. We want something we can really rely on. And so as we turn to this new series on Sunday evenings, we're going to ask ourselves, can we trust that Jesus, the Jesus we read about, right, that we spend so much time reading and studying about, can we trust that this Jesus is authentic, that he's trustworthy? Can we trust that the things we know about him are real, and that we can rely on that, and that we can invest our whole lives into those things? Because what if we trusted in something that was not true? I don't know if you've ever thought about that. It's kind of a sobering thing to think about, trusting in something that's not actually true. And I want to give a couple of examples as we begin, because it happens. It happens in religious circles very, very seriously. For those of you who may have been around a little bit longer, you probably know that about a gentleman named Jim Jones, right? In the Evergreen Cemetery in Oakland, California, there's a headstone that reads, "In memory of those lost in the Jonestown tragedy." And underneath that headstone, there are the bodies of 400 Californians that passed away in the Jonestown tragedy. It breaks my heart to even think about this tragedy, just for the record, because they followed the wrong leader. That's the best way I can phrase that. They followed in someone, they put their faith in someone who was not real, who said he was one thing, and it turns out he was something totally different. National Geographic did a whole issue a few years ago on people who said they were the new savior that are currently living right now. And so it's not like it's just Jim Jones, it's not just these guys, but I want to talk a little bit about Jim Jones. So under that headstone, we see the remains of those 400 people in California. Let me tell you a little bit of history on that, for those of you who maybe are unfamiliar with how that went. It started like any other church group kind of started. Jim Jones started what's called the People's Temple. It was initially started as this great idea for a church that really focuses on homeless people and people with needs and people who are sick. And it sounded all right when it all began. And it grew in Indianapolis to about 900 members. And it was just considered a normal, mainline Christian church at that point. And so up to that point in the 1950s, everything seemed pretty normal. It was pretty normal until a government investigation popped up because apparently Jim Jones had some cures for things like arthritis and cancer that he was trying to push through this church as well. And so as they were trying to push through all those things, heart disease, arthritis, cancer, all those things, they decided to move to North California. And then eventually they moved in the mid-70s down a little bit farther south to San Francisco and later moved to San Francisco and then Los Angeles. And at that point, things were kind of weird. Things were a little shaky. Some weird news reports were coming out. And you can watch whole documentaries on this, and they will mess up your day because they're so bad. But you can watch the documentaries, and they talk about the people at that time and the things that were happening. And there were a lot of questions that began to bubble up about this. And the more things kind of leaked out about what the People's Temple were doing, all of a sudden more criticism came. And so Jim Jones had a great idea. They moved the temple to Jonestown, Guyana at that point. And they were down there, all separate from their families, all totally separated, all apart, where they could just live in their little commune in the middle of nowhere where no one would ever bother them or ask too many questions. And they really believed in this guy, Jim Jones, right? They trusted him with everything. They moved, think about that. They gave up their lives here to move to South America to start a new life. And so they were very dedicated. And then in the 1970s, late 1970s at this point, human rights violations, more things were even trickling out. He couldn't control every bit of information. People were leaving, even though he didn't want them to leave, and things kind of started to fall apart at Jonestown. And so a congressman decided he was going to go down there, and Congressman Leo Ryan said he was going to visit Jonestown in 1978. He was going to go visit. And as he went down there, everything went pretty well at the beginning of that trip. Everything seemed normal. They thought maybe we just heard some disgruntled members. Anytime you have disgruntled people leaving anything, a company, a congregation, anything, there's going to be some bad stuff said, and they thought it's fine. Well, as they were leaving, the congressmen and some members of the press, as they were all leaving to load back up onto their airplane, I think it was 16 members of the People's Temple wanted to leave as well. 16 of them said, we want to go home. We want out of here. And as they were all getting ready and the plane was on the tarmac and they were loading up, some temple guardsmen came and started shooting the place up. Apparently, they knew that if people got out, it was going to be a bad thing. They would hear all the terrible things that were going on there, that it would just totally ruin them. And so they shot up the plane. People were killed. Most of them were injured, even the ones who weren't killed. And that's just the beginning. Because as most of you know, what happened right after that is one of the most terrible things we can think about. At that point, Jim Jones and the people decided the best thing they could do is commit group suicide. And so they did. They drank, as we would say, drinking the Kool-Aid. That's where that phrase comes from, right? And so they drank Kool-Aid mixed with all kinds of poisons, and they killed themselves because they're afraid of what was going to happen if people found out what was going, because they followed this guy. In total, 914 people died. I had a slide from like aerial view, but it really disturbs me every time I see that, so I took it off. But 914 people passed away. That's 638 adults and 276 children. The ones who wouldn't drink it, children were injected with the poison, and the adults who wouldn't drink it were shot. And this whole community of almost 1,000 people were killed in that moment because they followed the wrong leader, because they trusted this guy, and he led them astray because he was not authentic. He was not who he said he was. And there's so many lessons we can learn from that, but it's just our example today. Our second one, as you saw, is probably one a little bit weirder, if I can even say that. It's Heaven's Gate. The Heaven's Gate cult, if you remember, this one was back in 1996, I believe, when the comet Hale-Bopp was passing nearby the Earth. I was going to say the U.S., but the Earth, and you could see it. You could see it with your plain eyes. You could see it up there in the sky every night. I remember I was a sixth grader at the time, being able to identify it in the night sky. Well, this was 23 years ago. 39 people decided in identical robes. You see the pictures there. The identical robes, the Nike trainers, this really weird thing, decided to also commit group suicide. And they were all led by this guy named Marshall Applewhite, and you should look him up. He actually started just like Jim Jones, as any normal mainstream Christian preacher. He's a Christian preacher's son and everything like that. And he was one, of course, that he also took part in this. But when the comet passed close to Earth in 1996, he believed, and I'm going to make sure I read this correctly so you don't think I've got this wrong, Applewhite believed his alien incarnation was traveling behind the comet in a UFO on an interstellar mission to collect him and his disciples. And that's what he taught. And you think, well, who would believe that? Well, 39 people believe that enough, because he taught them that they had to let go of these earthly bodies if they were going to get on that comet and take that ride to heaven with them. Fun fact, with the Heaven's Gate, only 2 people from that group did not take part in that suicide, because their job, I kid you not, their job is to keep that website running exactly like it was in 1996. You can visit that website. That's a screenshot from the website that I took like a year ago. Because it looks exactly like that. They keep it up to date. They answer emails. They do all those things. But the moral of that story is he taught them that they had to break away from this world. And again, they followed this wrong leader. And it's not just these guys. There's modern examples. There's old examples. There's examples all the way down of people who followed the wrong leader and the example that set. These people who followed them, you have to really think about it. They didn't sort of kind of believe in these guys. They didn't think, well, maybe this guy's right, maybe he's not, maybe it's worth a shot. No. These guys were totally dedicated to their faith in these guys. And what we're going to realize today is that isn't just a 21st century problem or 20th century problem. These are problems that have always occurred. And as we look into our topic today, you're going to see why that's important. Because with these decisions on who we trust in have real earthly consequences, but spiritual consequences, eternal consequences that go along with them even greater. And that's why for the next month or two, we're going to be looking at this case for the real Jesus. We're going to be using, like I said, some of Lee Strobel's information and kind of basing our lessons off of that to find who this authentic Jesus is and if we can even trust who Jesus is. And I'm just guessing if you're here on a Sunday night, you really believe in Jesus, which is a great start. But I want to firm up that faith with these studies that we go through. And so the overall question is going to be, can we trust that the Jesus in the Bible is who he actually says he is? And the question I want to start with today is, what about all these other gospels? What about these lost gospels? Maybe I think that's how I actually phrase it. What about these lost gospels? You might be thinking, though, Patty, I don't even have a clue what you're talking about. Well, let me clue you in if you don't, okay? So especially if you kind of tune into channels like National Geographic and stuff, come about Christmas and Easter every year, they're going to do some specials. And they're going to do specials on what they're going to call these lost gospels. They're going to say, look, hey, there's books, Christians, you've got your Bible, right? You've got them, but did you know in 1959 they found other gospels that fit in there? And they're going to say, let us tell you about these gospels. And they're going to want to teach you about that. And there's going to be some good-sounding stuff, and there's going to be some really weird-sounding stuff. We'll get into some of that in just a minute. But what you need to understand is that if you don't really look at those deeply, if you don't critically look at those things, you can easily be led astray. Just like we were talking about with these other guys. That while some of them may have some good-sounding stuff, we really need to dig in and investigate what's actually in them and where they came from and why they came up maybe and try to find out all the real information and who discovered them and where and all the details about that. We won't get into all that, but I want to give you just a basic breakdown of that tonight. And so the key is, though, don't take any of this stuff at just face value. Do like you would do anything else. We live in a world where fake news is like a daily word now, right? Treat it like you would any news and say, let me at least look into this and see if it is real on your own, because you can get really quickly confused when you look at some of these. Let me just lay out the end of this, though, because I always like to lay out the end before I give you the beginning on some of this stuff. These Gospels teach a very different lesson than the Gospels that we have in our Bible. And that's why they need to be investigated, because the moral of those stories is not what Jesus is teaching. The gist of what they're teaching is not salvation through Jesus. They're teaching some mystical kind of offshoot teachings that go with it. But with that, at least you know where we're going to end. With that, let's actually look into it and kind of see. We're going to look at a few different, actually, we're going to focus really in on one, but let me introduce you to a couple of these lost Gospels, right, and a little bit about what they're teaching. First, there's the Gospel of Judas. Okay, if you've never heard of that one, the Gospel of Judas teaches that Judas Iscariot, you know him, was Jesus' greatest disciple, and that he alone was able to understand the deepest teachings of Christ. And that Judas and Jesus conspired to arrange for the betrayal, that it was an inside job from the beginning. We saw this, I think it was CNN last Christmas, we saw a special on the Gospel of Judas, kind of teaching that Judas was the only one who really got it. That's the teaching. He's the one. He's the one that had the closest relationship with Jesus. There's the Jesus papers, which are a little less known. They claim Jesus says that he's not the Son of God, that Jesus should not, and that he's just God's Spirit, and anyone can embody God's Spirit in the same way Jesus did if you just try hard enough. And that's the Jesus papers. There's the secret gospel of Mark, where it's really weird stuff in that one as well, where its most controversial claims that the gospel of Jesus is performed in a secret initiation, which we'll just say includes a physical union, okay? And so there's some teaching. You say, I don't remember any of that stuff in the Bible, right? Like this, but these are things that people are discovering and trying to push. The Gospel of Mary, which again kind of makes a debut every once in a while, says that salvation is achieved by seeking the spiritual nature of humanity within yourself and overcoming the entrapping material nature of the body of the world. You don't have to look too deep in that to say, that's not the teachings of Jesus. That's not, what I love about Scripture, by the way, is that you can read from Genesis to Revelation, you get the idea of Scripture. You can see God at every phase in every book. You can see the plan of salvation playing its way out. But when you start to look into these, quote, lost gospels, you start to see that it's a totally different message. It's trying to pull in a different direction. And so you just need to know there are some strange things floating around. And so when you hear there's a new gospel, whether it's written by Judas or Mary or Thomas, like the one we're going to look at in just a little bit, that teaches some unknown teaching, like, oh man, there's this new gospel that teaches this great thing that everyone needs to know, what should we do? Well, Lee Strobel, he puts it this way, it's the best. It's kind of boiled down what this whole chapter in his book is on, is that you would treat it just like you would any new discovery, whether it was a secular discovery or a religious discovery, that you should investigate it. You should just look into where it came from and what is it all about, and just actually pay some attention. And that investigation normally makes it perfectly clear how we should treat these things. And so with that in mind, okay, that's kind of our beginning today. With that in mind, I want to look at some of these things, these new ideas and these new concepts that come through, kind of with that idea of, again, following the wrong leader has some very real consequences to it. And I think these extra gospels let me rephrase that. These extra gospels, these lost gospels, are a great example of how we can be pulled astray if we're not paying attention. So let's start with, why do we even want to trust in the four gospels? That's got to be the beginning of this, right? Why should we trust in the books of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in our Bibles? What gives them any extra credibility? And we're not going to go through the whole long process, but I do want to point out a few things that make them so very credible. First, I don't know if you noticed this, they all agree. They all contain, generally speaking, the same message and the same information and the same details. There may be a little difference, but you can imagine if you've got different people writing from different time frames, some of the minor details may be a little different. It may say two guys were with him at one point and one guy was with him another, but deep down the same message is being pushed all through all the Gospels. And so first off, they all agree. I did my, it was my end of my undergraduate, I did a big paper on the synoptic problem, on how these differences shouldn't bother us. There's a whole discussion for another day. But we need to realize they're not word for word the same. That actually kind of helps their credibility, because if they just copied each other's work, we probably wouldn't trust them as much. And so we all see they agree with each other independently. And honestly, I think we take that for granted sometimes because of how cool of a concept that is, to really think about that. But they all share that same message about the teachings of Jesus, the death of Jesus, the resurrection of Jesus. All that's contained, all that matches up. Historically speaking, it all matches up together. Let's use an example of this, okay, to think about this. Let's think back to who was elected governor of Alabama in 1950. I had to do a little history on this one to figure it out. Harvey, do you know who was elected? No, don't worry. I told him this morning I was going to call him on it, or I didn't tell him what. I said I was going to call on him. Let's think, if we were trying to discover, no one here remembers off the top of their head maybe, who was elected governor of the state of Alabama in 1950. So for the sake of argument, let's say we have 4 total documents. We have newspapers from Huntsville, we have newspapers from Birmingham, we have newspapers from Montgomery, and we have a newspaper from Mobile. Let's say we have those 4 major cities' newspapers, and we're trying to figure out who won the election in 1950. So we pull out our 4 newspapers, and we look, and the paper from Huntsville, and the paper from Birmingham, and the paper from Montgomery all say this guy named Gordon Persons, it's the real guy, Gordon Persons was elected governor of the state of Alabama in 1950. All right, that's 3 of the 4, but let's see. And then we pull up Mobile. Let's say Mobile, though, pulls out, and Mobile's paper says something different. It says this guy named Michael Scott was elected governor of Alabama in 1950. You think, so which one do you trust? Just right off initial reaction, which one would you trust? You say, well, the 3 of them say this, and then Mobile, I don't know what they're doing down in Mobile, but Mobile says Michael Scott? That dude, I mean, come on, Michael Scott. We can't even believe that. So let's kind of hold on to that for a minute, okay? That's the first. They all agree. It's that same idea where all the information kind of agrees. And then the second part, though, is that the details match in our Gospels the time frame they were written, the information of the day. And so the people that the Gospels talk about, the places that the Gospels talk about, the culture that the Gospels talk about, it all matches up with what's actually going on during that time. And so let's say we're looking at our 4 papers again. And again, we've got Huntsville, we've got Birmingham, we've got Montgomery, and Mobile's kind of the weird shot right now, kind of hanging on at the end. And let's say that Huntsville and Birmingham and the Montgomery one, when you're reading, they say this Gordon Persons was elected governor in 1950, and then you look and the details are correct in that paper. The ads that show for things that are being bought and sold, that makes sense for the day. The people that they talk about endorsing the candidate maybe, those type of details match up. And so you've got all this information that's matching up the culture of the time, but then you're reading the Mobile paper, and you see that, it's got different people kind of advertising or supporting the governor. They say, well, Michael Scott, he had some different people that were trying to pull him along in the race. And it's guys like Johnny Cash, who really wasn't a thing back in 1950, right? He was later, but not by 1950. And if they said, well, and also the issues that Michael Scott wanted to talk about was paving 65, repaving Interstate 65. And then some of you who are alive at that time were like, I don't even think 65 was built back then, was it? It's like, wow, it sounded right for a minute. Johnny Cash sounds right until you realize he wasn't really a thing back then. You're like, well, the details sounded right on the onset, but now it's not adding up with the culture of the day. So you kind of see those are the first 2 things that we can see. And you start to think, maybe this paper from Mobile really isn't authentic. Maybe it's not really showing us what we really need to believe in. Maybe it was written later, even, after the fact, and someone's trying to put in details that sound right. And then finally, our Gospels they don't only have the same message, they don't only fit the issues of the day, they also were accepted, our Gospels, by the people who were alive at the time of circulation. That's like saying the people who saw these things written, when they saw them at first, they didn't say, wait, this isn't right. They didn't say, hey, I know you said Jesus was here. This place wasn't a thing. Or I know you said Jesus taught this, but he didn't actually teach that. No, the people who were alive, they accepted those teachings. So going back to our newspaper example, it would be like if I handed Harvey that paper from 1950, and we were talking about this, said, Harvey, well, which one's actually right? Because I guess in 1950, you're old enough to remember 1950. He goes, no, I remember. I don't know who you voted for that year, but let's say, no, I remember Gordon Persons was governor. Maybe he'd even say, I didn't even vote for the guy. I didn't like the guy. I think like 98% of Alabama voted for him that year, by the way. It was a landslide. But he could say, no, I remember him campaigning. I heard him talk. I remember these were his issues. I remember these were the people that were supporting him. And if I handed him this other one about this Michael Scott guy, he'd say that there's no way that's right. Those details don't match up. Those things weren't for sale during that day. We didn't need those things then, and the details of the day just don't add up. But when we look at the Gospels, we see how all of those things add up. But that kind of oddball Mobile paper, that's how these lost Gospels kind of appear. They come in, they teach something a little different, they try to sound right most of the time, but but no one accepted them, or they weren't circulated during the day. They were just recently found. And there's just so many things that don't add up with them outside of even their teachings. Just scientifically speaking, if you're just looking at it as a historical document, you wouldn't ever trust in these things. So now let's kind of turn that around. So why can't we trust in these lost gospels, or why shouldn't we? Because they teach something a little different, and if their teachings are real, and if we look deep down into them and stuff, we probably need to at least look at the teachings to see what we can pull from that. The easiest way to describe them, though, is remember, kind of like that odd paper saying Michael Scott was elected governor here. The details don't add up. They can't be verified with people who are alive. And so what I want to do is actually take the Gospel of Thomas. I pulled that one because it's the easiest. I found it. It's 114 verses long. I found it online, and I verified that I had the right document because there's a couple different translations, like anything floating around. But 114 verses long, and it's kind of written like the book of Proverbs. And that's the one I decided, let's actually look into that. Let's pull some teachings from it. It's not super duper weird, where like it's awkward talking about it, but it's still got some stuff we need to look at. And so kind of keep that in mind. So we're going to look at that. First, let's just think. Does the overall message in the Gospel of Thomas match up with the rest of the Gospels? That's the easiest thing we can first pull out. So if you have your Bibles or you want to follow along on the screens, we're going to look at some scriptures and we're going to look at the Gospel of Thomas. And we're going to kind of go back and forth on what those things teach. And so we're going to start in Matthew chapter 16. What's the overall message of the gospel, right? What are some of the basic foundational teachings of it? What are some of the things Jesus interacted, or how did Jesus interact with his disciples? So Matthew chapter 16, verse 13, we have this great confession of Peter, right? And that's what I want to look at. Because if we're going to look for a basic principle, I think this great confession is one of those principles. So Matthew chapter 16, going down to we'll start in verse 13, and we'll go through pretty much verse 20, just to make sure we get the context here correct. Now, when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." He said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter replied, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." Then he strictly charged the disciples to tell no one that he was the Christ. Peter's great confession, right? That's like a foundation point. If we can't start there, where can we start? Well, let's kind of get an idea how this transaction occurs in the Gospel of Thomas. So the Gospel of Thomas, verse 13 is where we're going to pick up. We're going to see what that gospel says. I'm going to make sure I read it correctly here. Jesus said to his disciples, "Compare me to someone and tell me whom I'm like." Simon Peter said to him, "You are like a righteous angel." Matthew said to him, "You are a wise philosopher." Thomas said to him, "Master, my mouth is wholly incapable of saying whom you are like." Jesus said, am I not, your master? Because you have drunk and you have become intoxicated from the bubbling spring which I have measured out. And he took him and withdrew and told him 3 things. When Thomas returned to his companions, they asked, "What did Jesus say to you?" Thomas said to them, "If I tell you one of the things which he told me, you will pick up stones and throw them at me, and fire will come out of the stones and burn you up." Kind of like you take some of it, right? It's like a middle schooler lying, if I'm just being honest. You take some of the information, right? And then you kind of mix it in with what you kind of want to get across, because in the Gospel of Thomas, what you when you read it, you get is that this understanding of who Jesus is portrayed as this almost like, I don't even know the right word off the top of my head, but you have to have this deep understanding. It's almost just this intellectual thing that you've got to come to this intellectual grasp of who Jesus is. And once you come to that intellectual grasp, then you've made it. And that's why Thomas can't tell the other disciples what's so good, because he's so high and above them intellectually. With these things Jesus has taught them. But you start to see kind of the differences there. In our Gospels, the Gospels that have been vetted for centuries, We see, the great confession. We see the explanation. We understand it fits the culture of the time. Everything fits at that time. The people talked about fit everything. And then the Gospel of Thomas is just kind of thrown out. By the way, each of these verses is its own little, that's why I said it's written kind of like Proverbs. They all kind of stand alone. It kind of jumps from one thing to the next, and then to the next, and to the next. And that's just one little excerpt from that. Next, let's look at what Jesus teaches real quick about fasting and prayer and giving. So we'll go back to Matthew chapter 6, because that's fresh on our minds, right? In Matthew chapter 6, verses 16 through 18, we kind of get this idea. Let's just review real quick. And when you fast, do not look gloomy like the hypocrites, for they disfigure their faces, that their fasting may be seen by others. Truly I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you fast, anoint your head and wash your face, that your fasting may not be seen of others, but by your Father who is in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will reward you. I don't want you to miss that last line. He will reward you. Let's compare that to the next verse in the Gospel of Thomas. That's verse 14. Jesus said to them, if you fast, you will give rise to sin for yourselves. And if you pray, you will be condemned. And if you give alms, you will do harm to your spirits. When you go into any land and walk about in its districts, if they receive you, eat what they will set before you, and heal the sick among them. For what goes into your mouth will not defile you, but that which issues from your mouth, it is that which will defile you. You notice that first part, though? He says, don't fast. Don't give to people in need. Don't even pray, right? It's kind of almost this negative connotation that's applied to them. And I looked back and forth. I didn't read any commentaries on the book of Thomas, for the record. I just read the text. I looked at front to back, cover to cover, trying to uncover the mystery of this one. I couldn't even figure it out. But there's a different message in our Gospels, and Jesus himself is saying, look, your God who sees in secret will reward you. And here, Thomas's teaching is no, they're saying, Jesus is saying, don't even take part in those things. Now let's finish up with one final passage from the Gospel of Thomas. It's the very last verse, and so it's one that, and it kind of stands out on its own. You can kind of get an understanding of how far some of these teachings go. So from the Gospel of Thomas, verse 114, Simon Peter said to him, let Mary leave us, for women are not worthy of life. Jesus said, I myself shall lead her in order to make her male, so that she too may become a living spirit resembling you males. For every woman who will make herself a male will enter the kingdom of heaven. There's no way that's taught in the Gospels, right? We could look back and we could say, I remember Jesus taught. He says, look, he quotes Genesis 1:27 when he says God created them male and female, right? He goes through all, and yet here in the Gospel of Thomas, there's some secret thing where women have to become men. There's no explanation, again, in the text that we have. And so time and time again, you see how things don't add up. And I know there's some crazy stuff out there, but here's what I think. Because you got to come back to this. They're not putting this stuff out. People aren't finding these things. They aren't making documentaries on this stuff for no reason, are they? There's a reason people are consuming so much of this, and it's not just people who are interested intellectually. Deep down, my concern, this is really where I want to plant this, is there's kind of a feeling where the simplicity of the gospel is no longer good enough for some people. The simple gospel message that Jesus, the Son of God, came to earth, lived a life, was crucified on a cross for the forgiveness of our sins, went to that grave for 3 days, and came back out. That simple message is not enough for so many people. There's got to be more to it. There's got to be some intellectual thing. There's got to be some more ritual to it. There's got to be some other things that we just don't know, and so they're digging for these things, and somebody along the way, if I'm just being blunt, cooked up these extra gospels trying to add to it, and whether it was 1,000 years ago or 500 years ago, it doesn't matter. They're trying to put all this information there that's not really there. And so I want you to think about that within yourself, the simplicity of the gospel. Is that where you fall, where you can read the gospel and you can say, man, it's so simple, so deep, and so beautiful all at the same time, that Jesus forgives our sins, that there's no secret females becoming males, there's none of that going on. It's just God created us all in the beginning. It's quite simple. And that's why we're here. And that's why I love the church, for the record, because we just turn back to the scriptures for everything, right? And we just simply say, what's the Bible say about that? And so as we conclude this evening, I want you to think about that. If the simplicity of the gospel is enough for you, if you need some extra stuff, now it's kind of a weird thing. We probably don't talk about it enough. But if the simplicity of the gospel is not enough, let it be enough for you. Let it fill you up and be the driving force for you. Don't worry about all this other stuff. Look into it. Investigate it. You don't have to ignore it. I just encourage you to investigate it like you would anything else. And don't be afraid of it. But look and see the true teachings. But then realize the true teachings of Jesus that have been tested and proven time and time again. And one of those teachings is that Jesus died on the cross for the forgiveness of our sins. It's the core teaching there, that Jesus is the Son of God, like Peter said. And man, if you want to make that great confession and put on Christ in baptism, or if you have some sin you want the prayers and support of the church to support you with, we would love to help you out with that this evening. If there's anything we can do for you, why don't you come as we stand and sing?